I'm going to move on to another question now, and I think this is partly because Tony let his phone go off. He did ask two questions. I'm going to ask him, there's one about Merton rule, I think perhaps you might like to ask Tony.
Has the Merton rule been an effective and measurable method of encouraging developers to provide on-site renewable energy?
Who's interested or knows about the Merton rule?
Again, sorry, I keep on coming in. But I think yes, possibly, is the short answer. I think one of its fundamental raison d'etre was to encourage energy efficiency, because renewables were at the time it was dreamt up. Renewables were so expensive that the key thing was to try and get your initial energy consumption down, so that you reduce the amount of renewables you had to provide. So I think the trouble is, if you then have incentives to use particular technologies like the feed-in tariff, that mathematics gets distorted, and I think that's sort of slightly dangerous. And I also think there's, I think it's also responsible for a lot of sort of token renewables, wind turbines that never went round, or pointing in different directions and never worked. So I think there's a danger of the sort of tokenism and using inappropriate technologies on sites, urban wind, for example.
Yeah, there was. I have read a report by a consortium of house builders, not necessarily unbiased, but they came out with the interesting result that, you know, pound for pound, in energy terms and CO2 reduction, it was better to spend the money on insulation in housing by a margin. So actually, it's a distortion. It could be looked at in those terms. It has led, it's not necessarily causally related, but there is evidence that along with the Merton rule spreading around the country, there has been a far greater uptake in solar thermal. Now, so you might say, yes, there has been a result. I think we need to look at the economics of that to see whether that's a good result or not. But there are some instances, there's some data that suggests that it has been a positive result, if that's a positive result.
Okay, thank you. I think perhaps, is there anybody, I don't want to do this all from the questions that came in advance. Is anybody burning to ask a question from the audience? Yes, over here. Could you?
Yes, David Stockdale. I'm a Development Control Manager with South Gloucestershire Council. The current government has indicated that it wants to reduce the burden on business. Mr Pickles has indicated that, and the general government philosophy is to reduce top-down government. So as it doesn't appear too political, the previous government has allowed a large number of developments to take place under the 2006 building regulations. Developers are allowed to sign up, have been allowed prior to the 1st of October of last year to sign up under the 2006 building regulations. South Gloucestershire Council apparently has 800 schemes that are awaiting development that have been signed up under the 2006 building regulations. So therefore, I understand that's 25% less efficient than currently would be the case. So my question is, do you feel there is a real commitment by government to the whole subject?
I'd like to kick off with that one. That's Sergio.
Yeah, I think that the issue of commitment is quite an interesting one. Well, one of the things that we have to say is that targets have been set. If we look at the UK perspective within the context of a broader European perspective, we are forced to meet specific targets. Therefore, the commitment has to be in place. On the other hand, we have to remind ourselves that that commitment and the overall, if you look at actually the European 2020 strategy, came also at a time where we are facing one of the greatest economic crisis of the last 80 years. So the way in which you actually meet the economic challenge together with the environmental challenge is quite a delicate issue. Although I guess that when there is a problem, where there is a specific constraint, there's always quite a lot of creativity that could actually come out of there. I think that, yes, we have to be all committed to the target of reducing our energy consumption, reducing our carbon footprint, and so forth. First of all, because obviously, I mean, we have set rules. But on the other hand, I think that the commitment should actually come from a sort of a bottom-up approach rather than necessarily and uniquely from a top-down approach. Of course, if we want to meet the target, if we want to sort of make sure that our buildings and our designs comply with the regulations, it is something that we have to consider, I mean, starting from the education of architects and engineers up until the way in which we design buildings. But on the other hand, we have to consider whether we are able not only to meet the targets, but also to create better buildings. It's actually interesting this morning, the presentation by Linda Farrow was actually saying, what if this is a big hoax and we're just creating a better world from nothing? So I guess this is something that we have to consider. I mean, not only putting as a priority the meeting of the targets, but also creating spaces, creating environments which sustain much better human life, other than sustaining just our economy or our energy budget.
I'm sorry, I'm always very skeptical about those things. I don't understand how they are going to do this big society. I don't understand how they are going to kind of get this, how these local governments, which are struggling with the main services, are going to provide. I just don't get it. And maybe it's me, I'm very skeptical, and coming from Spain, we do things differently, worse, because we are about to take down, but I cannot, and I've been looking as well to the new definition of zero carbon and how they start defining different, and they've got this paper, I think, the government, which they have got out for consultation until the 15th of March of how they are going to comply with building regulation. They have a bit more, and something at the top which is about cost, which I don't really know how they are going to do it. I don't think they do know how they are going to do it. I think they're expecting someone to answer them and tell them how to do it. I just don't see it happening. And the other thing is, like, you've got 800 new homes to be, or 800 you said to be built, but no one is telling you either. It's like, what are you going to do with all the existing stock that you need to refurbish, which probably is going to be worse than the 800 new homes that you are doing at a level of building regulation 2006. It will be more worrying all the other stock that you have got within your council. That is going to be more difficult to kind of get it up. And the other thing is how much people is going to be able to pay to upgrade their houses to have a good levels. And on top of that, you have to pay more council tax. And I don't see this big society happening very well. I don't know, but I'm very skeptical about that.
Okay. Sorry. But, I mean, it is the greenest government ever, I think you'll find. So that's the commitment.
Well, could I just say, I mean, well, we don't want to be party political because, anyway. But one thing I did notice was what was formerly known as the carbon reduction commitment is now rebranded as CRC energy efficiency, brackets. And what used to be declared as revenue neutral, in that some would pay in and others would pay out, is now actually it's just a taxation. So there's no money going back in. So you wonder what else is shifting around behind the scenes.
I have to say, Bill, that I like your definition that it's the greenest government ever, but I also point out there are two meanings of the word green.
I think what's interesting about the energy costs, when people are whinging about increasing standards, when I was on the Zero Carbon Hub carbon compliance group, and the house builders there, when the costs were worked out, the real difference, the real thing that hits them are the Section 106 attachments to projects. And actually the extra over costs for increased energy performance were relatively small in comparison. So we do make choices as a society. And do you have a school or do you have slightly more energy efficient buildings? So I think there are issues there. I'm a fascist myself, and I'm a centralist. And I think one of the jobs of government is to make difficult decisions about the things we need to do as a society. And I think we need some choices taken away. We've got too many choices at the moment. And all choice gives you is the ability to make the wrong choice. If you can get apples all the year round, you then agonize about whether you get the apples from South Africa or Chile. And get your atlas out in the supermarket to try and work out the embodied energy of those apples. If you don't have apples, you don't worry about it. I think it's...
Can I just say, I think there's also a relationship to how long you've been designing or in design, your attitude to regulation. I think as a young person, you rail against regulation that limits your choices in design terms. And then you get older, you realise you have to confront the society you're embedded in and reluctant clients and reluctant contractors. And you say, what we need is more regulation. And I think it's a life stage thing. And I've certainly got to the point where I'm a great believer in regulation. I think people need to be told what is possible and what is not.
I think it's a very interesting point you make about government governing. I think a really good example of that was what happened in Scotland with the referendum on the congestion charge, when it seemed patently self-evidently a good thing to have the congestion charge in Edinburgh. But they had a referendum, and of course people who wouldn't drive to work voted against it, so it didn't happen. So I think, in fact, it was within the powers of that government to make that decision and do it, and they'd have probably been pleased about it after a few years' time. So I think a very interesting point about governing.